Good morning, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and a good night. I am Patrick. This is Storytelling Imperfectly, and welcome to the channel. And if you're new to the channel, I am Patrick. I hope you like what you see. Thank you all for being here. Today, guys, I got a crazy missing person case for you. It's got a Stephen King vibe to it. It's almost something you would read in one of his novels. And I want to address it because this story about a missing person named Keith Reinhard. He disappeared. He was a writer. It was in Colorado. I don't know. Stick around. It's story time. Let's delve into this one and see if we can't figure out what happened to Keith Reinhard. Back in 1988, there was a man named Keith Reinhard. Keith was a sports writer for the Chicago Tribune in Chicago, Illinois. He had a great job, obviously, and he was a pretty stable fellow. But he had just got married to his wife Carolyn about 2 years prior, and at 49 years old, Keith felt like he needed to do something else with his life. So he went on sabbatical from his job with the Chicago Tribune and decided to go to Colorado and write a novel. It almost sounds like the beginning of Funny Farm, when Chevy Chase, if you haven't seen that movie, go check it out, it's hilarious. But Chevy Chase's character is a sports writer who then decides to write a novel and move to New England. However, it didn't work out well for him, and unfortunately, it doesn't work out too well for Keith either. Keith Reinhard told his wife Carolyn that he was going to go to a very small town. The name of this town was Silver Plume, Colorado. Now, Keith had a lifelong friend, a man that he had known for decades named Ted Parker, who owned a building and establishments and whatnot within Silver Plume. But Silver Plume was a tiny town, guys, not just a small town. It had about 160 residents. That means everybody knew everybody. Now, Ted was in good standing with the community. There was nothing nefarious about the guy, and he has been thoroughly investigated during this whole case and what went on in this case. But Ted and Keith, knowing each other for as long as they had, when Keith reached out to Ted and said, "Hey man, do you mind if I come stay in one of your buildings, and rent from you while I, work on this novel?" Ted said, "Sure, no problem." Now, Keith, when he moved to Silver Plume, he left his wife behind. She said she didn't like the idea of being separated from her husband, but she also wanted to give him the space that he felt like he needed. Now, whether Keith was going through some sort of midlife crisis or whether Carolyn and him had a healthy marriage even after only 2 years of being married, I don't really know. The reports say that everything was fine between them. But at the same time, for a man to all of a sudden just up and leave his wife of 2 years behind and move to Colorado without her, well, that might speak to a little turmoil within the relationship. Nonetheless, Carolyn said goodbye to her husband, Keith packed up his belongings, and he moved to Silver Plume. While there, he actually was renting out a space from his friend Ted, and he started his own antique shop. So, needless to say, in a small town of 160 people, it wasn't a thriving business. But he was finding time to work on his novel. But yet again, that wasn't turning out quite the way he expected. Things were going slow, writer's block being what it is. He was trying to come up with some good ideas. And that's when Keith found out about a man that had been renting the same apartment residence from Ted that now Keith was living in. And that man went missing. Now, the name of that guy was Tom Young. Tom had a very similar story to Keith. He had come and moved to Silver Plume. He had been working on a novel, all right? And when I said this had a Stephen King vibe, there's a lot of Stephen King stories that kind of start out with a writer moving to some remote area to work on a novel and things not going well. I mean, just look at The Shining, right? I mean, amongst other things, Secret Door or Secret Window, can't remember the name of that one correctly, but it was something like that. It had Johnny Depp in it. There's more than one story that Stephen King has penned about a writer moving out to a remote area and then losing their minds or something terrible happening or some monsters getting involved. But the weird thing is, this isn't a story. This is reality. and Tom Young had gone missing. Now, a year later, Tom's body was in fact discovered by some hikers, and he was, of course, deceased. When they found him, he was leaned up against a tree. His remains were. He had his dog in his lap, who was also dead. There was a pistol nearby and a gunshot wound to his head. He had also shot his dog. From all accounts and the case reports is that Tom Young had committed suicide. He had shot his dog and then he had shot himself. Why? Your guess is as good as mine. People commit suicide all the time in this country. Maybe the guy was depressed. Maybe something weird happened. We don't know. But Keith, on the other hand, also found this mystery of what happened to Tom Young fascinating. And it kicked off his creative juices, if you will, and he started writing this novel using the case of Tom Young. And so he went around to local establishments and business owners. He talked to the police. He wanted to find out all the information he could about Tom Young, his disappearance, and what had happened to the man. Well, after a while of researching this, and remember, this is a very small town, and so it was kind of an unpleasant thing, what happened to Tom Young. And a lot of people in the town were reluctant to talk about it. So Keith couldn't get a ton of information on it, but being a writer, he was starting to fill in the gaps and the voids in the story. And of course, he wasn't writing the Tom Young story. He was just using the premise of this guy moving to this town and disappearing the way he did in his story. So he was able to fill in a lot of the gaps, and his novel was going actually better than he expected, and a lot of people expected, including his wife Carolyn. He would call back to her in Chicago and be like, hey, things are going great. I'm writing. Things are moving forward. I'm really enjoying it here. Carolyn had made plans to actually go to Colorado, take time off from her job to visit her husband in a couple of months. And Keith was very much looking forward to that. But this is when things kind of go south. One day, in August of 1988, August 7th to be exact, Keith was seen around town multiple times walking around. Now, he said he wanted to climb the summit of a nearby mountain called Mount Pendleton. Now, a lot of people knew Mount Pendleton. It did have a trail going up to the summit, but it was kind of a rough climb. And from the base to the summit took about 6 hours to get it done. And this being August, in basically the end of summer, the seasons were shifting. It was starting to get darker sooner. And this particular day on August the 7th, as Keith walked around, numerous people saw him that morning. He seemed fine. But he did run into several people. And one of the first people he ran into was a guy he had made friends with since he had moved to Silver Plume, was a guy named Larry Doherty. Now, he asked Larry, he says, hey, man, I'm going to summit Mount Pendleton. Do you want to come? And Larry was like, man, no. He's like, that's kind of it's a hard climb. First of all, it's a pretty steep, hard hike. And secondly, it was getting later in the day. In fact, Larry stated that when he ran into Keith, it was around noon. So even if Larry and Keith left at that particular moment, they wouldn't reach the summit till 6 o'clock in the evening, and they wouldn't get back down until well after dark. And Larry's like, no, that's a terrible idea, man. You shouldn't do this. You should wait until tomorrow morning, leave early, hit the summit, then come back down, and you'll get, safely down in time. But Keith said, no, man, everything's great. And he walked on. There were 2 other people that ran into Keith that day, in which he had made friends with while living in Silver Plume, in which he asked, do you want to go up to Mount Pendleton with me? Do you want to go on a hike? And both these people, as well as Larry, said, no, man, it's too late in the afternoon. You won't get there to the summit till late. You won't make it back down until well after dark. This is a bad idea. But Keith seemed not to be deterred, that he really wanted to do this for whatever reason. Keith was last seen at the base of Mount Pendleton heading up the trail. He didn't have a backpack with him. He didn't have supplies with him. He just went, which is super weird, right? I mean, why would a man do this? He's been warned 3 times by 3 separate people that this was a bad idea, yet he seemed quite determined to do it for some unknown reason. Maybe he was compelled. Maybe there was some mysterious force. Who knows? Maybe there was something paranormal going on, and maybe there was something happening in the apartment that he was renting, the same apartment that Tom Young had rented, and Tom went missing as well. A lot of people have speculated that maybe digging into the Tom Young story brought on some nefarious things to Keith. You know, maybe some local residents had a problem with Tom, and in such a small town, they all hushed it up and they let it go and they buried it. I don't know. What I do know is that Keith did head up to summit Mount Pendleton on August the 7th, 1988. The next day, when Keith hadn't returned from Mount Pendleton, nobody saw him and nobody knew what had happened to him, of course, the sheriff's department got involved. Law enforcement was informed, and a giant search was actually... I mean, people from all over went looking for the man, including Ted Parker, who was his best friend and had known for years. There were quite a few agencies involved, helicopters, dog teams, all the locals got together and went up on Mount Pendleton to try to find Keith. Now, it was fact that Keith had tried to summit Mount Pendleton before, but he was sent back down by his own fatigue. It was a hard climb, guys. I mean, you're gaining thousands of feet of elevation, and the Rocky Mountains are already high in elevation to begin with. And if you're not from there and you're not used to hiking in that area, the thin air and the steep terrain can often just wear you out. And a lot of people aren't prepared. In Keith's case, we know from reports when he was seen at the bottom of the mountain that he didn't even take supplies with him. I mean, this guy was totally ill-prepared to go hiking up to Mount Pendleton and to try to summit it. But all we know is that this is why what he did. But why he did it, still a mystery to this day. In fact, the search was so in-depth that even the Civil Air Patrol got involved, and they were flying planes overhead. One particular plane actually crashed during the search for Keith. According to reports, the pilot experienced a lot of downdraft, which is pushing down on the aircraft. It was really bad conditions to be flying, but he went up anyway. He had a passenger, a spotter with him as he flew the plane, and when they experienced these severe downdrafts, it caused the plane to lose stability, lose control, and it actually crashed at around 10,600 feet. It killed the pilot, although the spotter, the passenger of the plane, did survive. After this, though, after the plane crashed during the search, and this search had gone on for days at this point in time, the plane crashed on August the 12th, 1988. And remember, Keith went missing on August 7th. So a few days into this search, when the plane crashed, it really put a damper on search efforts because now they had to go and retrieve the body of the pilot and, of course, rescue the downed, the spotter, the passenger in the plane. And all in all, it just kind of took the drive out of the search efforts for Keith, because when you lose somebody while you're looking for somebody, it has a tendency to be a bit depressing. And so shortly after this, the search was called off. To this day, Keith Reinhard has never been found. No trace of this man has ever been found. A lot of people have speculated that, again, him looking into Tom Young's death, the man whose apartment that Keith was now living in and who rented it out from Ted, Tom Young and he shared that space at one point in time. And for two men to be living in the same apartment in a town of 160 people and both of them to go missing, although Tom being found apparently dead from a suicide and Keith never to be found at all, is so weird, guys. And that's why I said that certainly has a Stephen King vibe to it. And again, a lot of people have said that the town is covering up something, that they've worked very hard to keep things quiet. There's not a lot of information about this case, and you can't find a lot of information about this case because everybody's pretty tight-lipped about it, even the sheriff's department. I don't know. I mean, this one's a head-scratcher for sure. However, I'd love to hear what you think about it. Please leave me something in the comment section below. I always love hearing from you guys. And also, if you haven't done it yet, guys, subscribe. Keep coming back, hanging out with me. But if you are subscribed, I hope you've hit that bell. And if you're a new subscriber, click that bell while you're out doing all that clicking. That way you won't miss out on the next video I upload. And more importantly, don't let the YouTube algorithm decide what you watch. But that's it for Patrick today, guys. I am out of here, and I will see you guys in the next video.